I'm Daniel Harrison, and this is the story of how my perfect life fell apart and how we built something new from the ashes. Grace and I had what most people would call a picture-perfect marriage. Our Tudor-style house in the suburbs came with a sprawling garden that was the envy of the neighborhood, thanks to old Tom, our gardener of 15 years. At 68, Tom had been more like family than an employee, joining us for holiday dinners and always bringing Grace fresh flowers from his greenhouse. "I think it's time for me to hang up my gardening gloves," Tom told us one evening over dinner. Grace had made his favorite pot roast as a thank you for the spectacular spring arrangements he'd created. "Tom, no." Grace's fork clattered against her plate. "The garden won't be the same without you." I watched my wife's genuine distress with affection. At 32, Grace had grown especially close to Tom over the years, learning about flowers and herbs from him. She'd always joked that he was the father figure she needed since her own dad lived across the country. "Mrs. Harrison," Tom said with his characteristic warmth, "all good things must come to an end. My arthritis isn't getting any better, and that garden deserves someone who can give it proper attention." I nodded, understanding his position. "We'll miss you, Tom. You've made this place magical." "Actually," Tom brightened, "I might know someone who could take over. My friend's nephew, Adrian Kelly. He's young, but he's got real talent. Studied horticulture and everything." Grace perked up at this. "Could you introduce us?" Looking back, I remember how her eyes lit up at the mention of a new gardener. Was it just enthusiasm for maintaining our garden's beauty, or was there something more? It's funny how memory plays tricks on you, coloring past events with the knowledge of what came after. Adrian came for an interview the following week. He was 27, tall, with the kind of rugged good looks that come from working outdoors. His handshake was firm, his smile confident but not cocky. "Your garden is legendary in the local landscaping community," Adrian said as we walked the grounds. "Tom's work here has been incredible. Do you think you can maintain his standards?" I asked, noticing how Grace walked slightly ahead of us, pointing out various features with animated gestures. "I have my own vision," Adrian replied, "but I respect what's been established here. Mrs. Harrison, those rose beds must be spectacular in full bloom." Grace beamed at him. "They are. Tom taught me everything about caring for them." "Maybe I could teach you some new techniques," Adrian suggested. "There are some modern approaches to rose cultivation that could make them even more spectacular." I remember feeling a slight twinge then. Something about the way they looked at each other, perhaps, but I dismissed it. Grace had always been passionate about the garden, and Adrian's enthusiasm seemed purely professional. We hired him on the spot. The first few weeks were uneventful. Adrian proved to be as skilled as Tom had promised, and the garden flourished under his care. I was busy with my investment firm, often working late hours to close important deals. Grace seemed happy, spending more time outdoors learning from Adrian, as she put it. The first real warning sign came during a dinner party we hosted for my colleagues. Grace had been talking about Adrian's plans for the garden, her eyes bright with excitement. "And Adrian thinks we should add a water feature near the rose garden," she was saying. "He says the sound of running water will create this amazing atmosphere." "Grace," I interrupted, perhaps more sharply than I intended, "I'm sure the partners don't want to hear every detail about our landscaping plans." She flushed slightly. "I was just—" "Actually, Sarah, one of my partner's wives, leaned forward. I'd love to hear more. Your garden is always so beautiful. And this new gardener sounds like he has wonderful ideas." I noticed something in Sarah's tone, a slight emphasis on wonderful that made me uncomfortable. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it now, coloring past events with what I know happened later. That night, after our guests left, Grace was unusually quiet as we cleaned up. "You embarrassed me at dinner," she finally said, loading the dishwasher with more force than necessary. "I just thought you were talking about Adrian a bit too much." She slammed a glass down. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. Just, you seem very invested in his plans." "Because I care about our home, Daniel. While you're working late every night, at least someone is helping me make improvements around here." The words hung between us like smoke. It was our first real argument in months, and it left an uneasy feeling in my stomach. But I pushed it aside, told myself I was being paranoid. Grace had always been passionate about the garden, It was one of the things I loved about her. If only I'd paid more attention to what that passion was growing into. The changes were subtle at first. Grace started wearing her nice sundresses to work in the garden, something she'd never done before, claiming she didn't want to ruin them. She began spending hours outside, even during the hottest part of the day. But it was the little things in her behavior that really started to nag at me. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed her applying lipstick. "Meeting someone today?" I asked casually. "What?" "No," she replied, too quickly. "I just want to look nice." "Is that a crime? At 7 a.m.? To garden?" She slammed her lipstick down. "Maybe I'm tired of looking like a housewife all the time. You barely notice me anymore anyway." The accusation stung. "That's not fair, Grace. I notice everything about you." "Really?" She turned to face me. "What color was I wearing yesterday?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I couldn't remember. "That's what I thought," she said, turning back to the mirror. "Our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, stopped me one evening as I was getting home late from work." Her face had that pinched look people get when they're about to share uncomfortable information. "Daniel, dear," she began, wringing her hands. "I don't want to cause any trouble." "What is it, Mrs. Jenkins?" "Well, it's just, I couldn't help but notice Grace and your new gardener spend an awful lot of time together. Sometimes until quite late." My stomach tightened. "They're working on the garden redesign." "Of course, dear," she patted my arm. "I'm sure that's all it is. Though I've never seen anyone laugh quite so much over mulch and fertilizer." That night, I tried to talk to Grace about it over dinner. "The neighbors are starting to talk," I said, pushing my food around the plate. "About what?" Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "About how much time you spend with Adrian." She set her fork down with deliberate slowness. "So now you're spying on me?" "I'm not spying. People are noticing, Grace. They're commenting." "Oh, so now you care what I do during the day? Now you're interested in the garden?" Her voice rose. "Where was this interest when I begged you to come home earlier? When I asked you to help me plan the new layouts? This isn't about the garden, and you know it." "Then what is it about, Daniel?" She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Tell me exactly what you're accusing me of." I couldn't say it. "Not yet. I'm just saying maybe we should set some boundaries with the staff." She laughed, but it wasn't her usual warm laugh. "Staff? He's our gardener, not a servant. And I'm not some Victorian lady who needs to be chaperoned." The next week, I started noticing other things. Adrian would look away quickly when I came home. Grace's phone would suddenly go silent when I entered a room. One evening, I came home early and found the garden empty, the tools left out, something Adrian had never done before. "Where's Adrian?" I asked Grace, who was in the kitchen making dinner. She jumped slightly. "Oh, he had a family emergency. Had to leave early." That night, I checked our security cameras. The footage showed Grace and Adrian entering the greenhouse together. They stayed there for over an hour. When they emerged, Grace was adjusting her dress, and Adrian was wiping something from his mouth. I felt sick. My friend Mark tried to reason with me over drinks the next day. "Maybe you're reading too much into things," he suggested. "Grace has always loved gardening." "You don't understand," I said, staring into my whiskey. "She's different now. Everything's different." "Different how?" "She's distant, defensive. The other night, I tried to kiss her, and she turned away, said she had a headache. I took a long drink. She never wants to be intimate anymore. Says she's too tired from working in the garden all day." Mark was quiet for a moment. "Have you thought about marriage counseling?" "For what?" "So I can tell a stranger I think my wife is sleeping with the gardener?" "Maybe you should take a day off," Mark suggested. "Surprise her. Show her you're interested in what she's doing." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe I should." What I didn't tell Mark was that I'd already decided to do exactly that. I'd cleared my schedule for the next day, told my secretary I'd be working from home. I wanted to see for myself what was really happening in my garden. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to the part of me that didn't want to know the truth. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The way Grace's face lit up when Adrian arrived each morning. The lingering touches when they examined plants together. The private jokes I wasn't part of. That night, Grace was texting someone while we watched TV. Work? I asked, knowing her boutique was closed at this hour. Just checking on some plant deliveries, she said, angling the phone away from me. I watched her smile at whatever message she'd received, and something inside me hardened. Tomorrow, I would know the truth, one way or another. I just never imagined how much that truth would cost us all. I woke up early that morning, went through my usual routine of getting dressed for work. Grace barely looked up from her coffee as I kissed her goodbye. Once I pulled out of the driveway, I circled back and parked a block away, waiting. Adrian's truck arrived at 8, right on schedule. From my vantage point, I could see Grace come out to greet him, wearing one of her new sundresses. They talked for a while, standing closer than necessary. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I watched them laugh together. Around 10, I walked back to the house, making sure to approach from the side where the hedges would keep me hidden. The sound of the lawnmower filled the air. Adrian always mowed the front lawn first. Perfect cover for what might be happening inside. I used my key to enter through the side door, moving quietly. The house felt different, strange, like I was an intruder in my own home. I heard voices from upstairs. Grace's laugh floated down the hallway, followed by a male voice saying something too low to make out. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like a mile. The bedroom door was partially open. What I saw next is burned into my memory forever. My wife, on our bed, with Adrian on top of her. The bed sheets I'd helped her pick out last spring tangled around them. Her hands in his hair, her wedding ring catching the morning light. Something snapped inside me. I must have made some sound because they suddenly froze. Grace's eyes met mine, widening in horror. Daniel. She scrambled to cover herself. Oh God. I barely heard her. I was already moving toward Adrian, who was trying to get off the bed and grab his clothes at the same time. Wait. He held up his hands. Mr. Harrison. My fist connected with his jaw before he could finish. He stumbled backward, blood spurting from his lip. Grace screamed. Daniel, stop, please. But I couldn't stop. Every suspicion, every doubt, every moment of uncertainty exploded into rage. I grabbed Adrian by the throat, slamming him against the wall. In my house, I roared. In my fucking bed? Grace was pulling at my arm, still wrapped in a sheet. You're going to kill him. Daniel, please. Adrian's face was turning red, his hands clawing at mine. Some small part of my brain knew I should let go, knew I could really hurt him, but the rage was too strong. Daniel. Grace's voice cracked with desperation. Think about what you're doing. Her words penetrated the fog of anger. I released Adrian, who collapsed, gasping for air. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his pants, and ran. I heard him stumbling down the stairs, the front door slamming. Mrs. Jenkins would later tell me she saw him running half-naked across our lawn. But at that moment, I couldn't think about anything except my wife, standing there wrapped in our bedsheet, crying. How long? My voice was hoarse. Daniel. How long? She flinched. 2 months. I laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. 2 months. In our bed. While I was at work, providing for us. Providing? She spat the word. Is that what you call being absent? Being too tired to talk? Too busy to notice I'm dying inside from loneliness? So you fucked the gardener? That's your solution? He saw me. She was shouting now, tears streaming down her face. He actually saw me. When was the last time you really looked at me, Daniel? When was the last time you asked about my day and actually listened to the answer? Don't you dare make this my fault. My voice was dangerously quiet. Don't you dare try to justify this. I'm not justifying it. She sank onto the bed, our bed, and buried her face in her hands. God, I'm not. He was there. He listened. He made me feel alive again. And I made you feel dead? Is that it? No. You made me feel invisible. We stared at each other across the room. 8 years of marriage lying in ruins between us. Through the window, I could still hear the lawnmower running, a surreal reminder of normalcy. I need to get out of here, I said finally. Where are you going? Does it matter? I turned toward the door. You clearly prefer me gone anyway. Daniel, wait. But I was already moving, down the stairs, out the door, away from the house that no longer felt like home. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Adrian's abandoned tools on the lawn, the lawnmower still idling in the summer heat. I drove aimlessly for hours, my phone buzzing with messages I couldn't bear to read. The image of them together played on repeat in my mind, each replay bringing a fresh wave of nausea. When I finally checked my phone, there were 17 missed calls from Grace, 3 from Mrs. Jenkins, and 1 from Mark. A text from Mrs. Jenkins read, "The whole street heard the shouting. Police came by to check. Call me if you need anything." Great. We were officially the neighborhood scandal. I ended up at Mark's house. He took one look at my face and my bloodied knuckles and pulled me inside. "Jesus, Dan," he said, handing me a whiskey. "What happened?" "I caught them," I said simply. "In our bed." He was quiet for a long moment. "Did you?" "No, I didn't kill him, though I wanted to." I drained the whiskey. "She tried to blame me," Mark said. "I made her feel invisible. That doesn't make it right." "No." I stared at my empty glass. "No, it fucking doesn't." I spent 3 days at Mark's place, ignoring Grace's calls and messages. My anger had crystallized into something cold and hard. During the day, I went to work, mechanically going through the motions. At night, I lay awake, plotting. "You need to talk to her eventually," Mark said over breakfast on the 4th day. "I need to destroy him first." Mark put down his coffee. "Daniel, think about what you're saying." "I already have." I pulled out my phone, showing him what I'd discovered. Adrian Kelly, 27, self-employed landscaper. Builds his business through word of mouth and recommendations. What happens when those recommendations turn negative? Dan. He fucked my wife in my bed, Mark, while I was paying him to tend my garden. Later that day, I made some calls. It turned out Adrian had quite a client list in our upscale neighborhood. Had. Past tense. When I finally went home, Grace was sitting in the dark living room, waiting. "Where have you been?" Her voice was raw. "Taking care of things." I dropped my bag by the door. "Adrian won't be working here anymore. Or anywhere in this neighborhood." She stood up. "What did you do?" I made some calls. Told some people what kind of man they had working in their homes. Around their wives. "You're trying to ruin him?" Her voice rose. "Daniel, he has loans to pay, a business to run. Should have thought about that before he climbed into my bed." I looked around the room. "Did you change the sheets at least?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I never meant to get caught." I interrupted. "Because you seemed pretty comfortable with the arrangement until then." "That's not fair." "Fair?" I laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that every time I close my eyes, I see you with him? Is it fair that our neighbors watched him run half naked across our lawn? Is it fair that I have to live with the knowledge that while I was working to give us a good life, you were spreading your legs for the help?" "Stop it." She was crying now. "Yes, I fucked up. I betrayed you. But you're not innocent here, Daniel. You checked out of this marriage long before Adrian came along. So you're still defending him?" "No. I'm trying to explain." "Explain what? How has Dick ended up inside you?" She slapped me. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "I hate what I did," she said, her voice shaking. "I hate that I hurt you. But I hate what you've become too." I touched my stinging cheek. "What I've become? You created this, Grace." The next few days were a blur of cold silences and heated arguments. Grace moved into the guest room. I threw myself into my revenge. It wasn't hard to spread the word about Adrian. A few strategic conversations with the right people, and his client list evaporated. I made sure Tom heard about it too, the man who'd recommended him. That burned the last bridges in the landscaping community. One evening, Adrian showed up at our door. I could smell alcohol on his breath. "You've ruined me," he slurred. "No one will hire me. Get off my property before I call the police." "I loved her," he said suddenly. "It wasn't just sex. I really loved her." Something snapped inside me again. I grabbed him by his shirt collar. "You loved her? You barely knew her. You saw a bored housewife and took advantage." "I knew her better than you did," he shot back. I knew about her dreams, her fears. When was the last time you asked her about those? I shoved him away. Get out. Grace appeared in the doorway. Adrian, you need to leave. He looked at her with such naked longing that I wanted to hit him again. Grace, please, she whispered. Just go. After he stumbled away, Grace turned to me. Are you happy now? Does destroying his life make you feel better? Actually, yes. I closed the door. Actions have consequences. Then what are my consequences, Daniel? What's my punishment? I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in days. She'd lost weight. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. Living with what you did, I said finally. That's your punishment. She nodded slowly. And living with what you're doing, destroying a man's livelihood out of revenge, that's yours. Later that night, I heard her crying in the guest room. Part of me wanted to go to her, to comfort her like I used to. But that part felt distant, unreachable. The man who would have done that died the moment he saw his wife in bed with another man. Mark called the next day. I heard about Adrian. He's leaving town. Good. Dan, this isn't you. This revenge thing. It's eating you up. Maybe it's exactly who I am now. I stared out my office window. Maybe this is who Grace turned me into. Or maybe, Mark said quietly, this is who you're choosing to become. His words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I drove home. What kind of man had I become? The kind who destroys lives? The kind who takes pleasure in another's downfall? When I got home, Grace was in the garden, pulling up the roses Adrian had planted. What are you doing? She didn't look up. Starting over. The therapist's office was painted a calming shade of blue, but nothing about this situation felt calm. Grace sat as far from me as the couch allowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Why are you both here today? Dr. Anderson asked. I laughed bitterly. Because my wife slept with our gardener. Because we're broken, Grace said quietly, and I don't know if we can fix it. The sessions became a weekly ritual, painful, but necessary, like lancing a wound to let it heal. We talked about everything: the affair, my revenge, our failing marriage before Adrian. When did you stop seeing each other? Dr. Anderson asked during one session. I saw her every day. I protested. No, Grace interjected. You looked at me, but you stopped seeing me years ago. I became part of the furniture, just another thing in your perfect house that you maintained but never really thought about. So you found someone who did see you? Adrian made me feel alive again. She glanced at me apologetically. I know that hurts you, but it's the truth. He looked at me like I was fascinating, beautiful, worth listening to. I thought you were beautiful, I said, my voice cracking. I thought you knew that. When was the last time you told me? I couldn't remember. At home, we existed in separate orbits. The garden lay abandoned. Neither of us could bear to hire a new gardener yet. The roses Grace had pulled up left ugly holes in the flower beds, like missing teeth in a smile. One evening, I found Grace looking through old photos. Remember this? She held up a picture from our early days. We were both laughing, covered in dirt from planting our first garden together. We were happy then, I said, sitting down beside her. We were present then, she corrected. We saw each other. Really saw each other. When did we stop? She sighed. Gradually. So gradually we didn't notice. You got promoted, started working longer hours. I threw myself into the house, the garden, trying to create this perfect life to make you proud. I was already proud of you. But you never said it. She closed the photo album. We stopped talking, Daniel. Really talking. About dreams, fears, silly things, important things. We just existed. And Adrian talked to you? He listened. He asked questions. He made me feel heard. She touched my hand hesitantly. What I did was wrong. So wrong. But we were broken long before he came along. I pulled my hand away. That doesn't excuse it. No, it doesn't. Nothing excuses betrayal. She stood up. But understanding why it happened might help us heal. If that's what you want. Is it what you want? I want to try. Her voice was barely a whisper. Do you? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photo, about how young and in love we were. When had we lost that? When had I stopped seeing my wife as that vibrant, fascinating woman I fell in love with? The next therapy session was particularly intense. I need to know everything, I said. Every detail of the affair. Daniel, Dr. Anderson cautioned, are you sure that's helpful? I need to understand why, how it started, all of it. Grace took a deep breath. It started with conversations. He would tell me about different flowers, their meanings. He noticed when I got my hair cut, commented on my dresses, small things. And then, one day, he kissed me in the greenhouse. I should have stopped it then, but she wiped away a tear. I felt desired again, seen again. It was intoxicating. Did you think about me at all? Every time, with crushing guilt. But then I'd remember how lonely I felt with you, and I'd justify it to myself. Dr. Anderson leaned forward. Grace, Daniel, this honesty is important. But now we need to decide. Do you want to rebuild? Or is this autopsy of your marriage just closure? Grace looked at me. I want to rebuild. But I know I've broken your trust completely. I know what I did was unforgivable. Not unforgivable, I said slowly. Just really fucking hard to forgive. That night, for the first time since discovering the affair, we had dinner together. Really together, not just occupying the same space. I miss us, Grace said, pushing her food around her plate. The real us, not what we became. I miss us too. I reached across the table and took her hand. Maybe we can find our way back. She squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. I'd like that. We weren't fixed, not even close. But something had shifted, like the first spring bulb breaking through frozen ground. A tiny hope of renewal. A year passed. Slowly, painfully, but it passed. Grace and I rebuilt our relationship piece by piece, like putting together a broken vase. The cracks would always be visible, but maybe that made it more precious. We knew how easily it could shatter. The garden had grown wild during our healing period. One morning, over coffee, Grace brought it up. We need to do something about the garden, she said hesitantly. It's becoming an eyesore. I tensed slightly. The subject of gardening was still sensitive. What do you suggest? I was thinking, maybe we could do it ourselves? Like we used to? The photo of us, young and dirty and laughing, flashed through my mind. Together? She nodded. Together. We started that weekend. It was hard work. Weeds had taken over, and the flower beds were a mess. But there was something therapeutic about it, working side by side, rebuilding our garden as we rebuilt our marriage. I found someone, Grace said one day as we were pulling weeds. A gardener. My hands stilled. Grace. He's 72, she added quickly. Mr. Peterson. Tom recommended him. I had to laugh. 72? I thought you'd be more comfortable with someone older. She was right. From that day forward, it became an unspoken rule. Our gardeners would always be older men, preferably grandfatherly types. It was one of those small accommodations we made for each other, acknowledging the scars while trying to move forward. One evening, as we sat on the patio looking at our restored garden, Grace turned to me. Do you ever think about having kids? The question caught me off guard. We talked about children before, but not since. Everything. Sometimes, I admitted. Do you? More and more lately. She looked out at the garden. Working together, rebuilding everything. It's made me realize what we can create when we really try. I took her hand. Are you saying you want to try? I'm saying I want to build something new with you. Something that's not about the past, but about our future. The decision to try for a baby wasn't made lightly. We spent months in therapy, making sure we were ready, that we were doing it for the right reasons. A baby won't fix what happened, Dr. Anderson warned us. We know, I said, holding Grace's hand. But we're not trying to fix the past anymore. We're building a future. Grace squeezed my hand. We're different people now. Stronger, maybe, more aware of what we could lose. One day, about 6 months later, I came home to find Grace sitting in the garden, crying. My heart stopped. What's wrong? She looked up at me, smiling through her tears, and held up a pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. I sat down next to her, pulling her close. The garden around us was in full bloom, tended now by Mr. Peterson, who told terrible dad jokes and brought us vegetables from his own garden. "Are you happy?" Grace whispered. "Yes," I said, and meant it. "Are you?" Terrified, excited, happy. She looked up at me. "I love you, Daniel. The real you, not some perfect version I thought I needed. I love you too. The real you, complicated and human in mine." We sat there in our rebuilt garden, holding each other and our future. The past wasn't erased. Adrian's name was still a scar between us, the memory of betrayal a shadow we'd always live with. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the broken places, carefully mended, made us stronger. The next morning, I watched Grace talking to Mr. Peterson about planting a small vegetable garden for the baby. Her face was glowing, but not with the dangerous excitement I'd seen with Adrian. This was deeper, more real, the joy of building something lasting. "You know," Mr. Peterson said to me later, his old hands expertly pruning a rose bush, "gardens are a lot like marriages. Sometimes you have to cut away the dead parts to let new growth happen. But if the roots are strong..." I looked at Grace, who was planning where to plant strawberries for our child to pick. "Yeah," I said. "If the roots are strong, it can survive anything." Later that night, lying in bed with Grace curled against me, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, I realized something. The affair, as painful as it was, had forced us to tear everything down to the foundation. But in rebuilding, we'd created something stronger, more honest, more real than what we had before. The baby would arrive in spring, when the garden was waking up. Mr. Peterson was already planning a special section of baby-safe plants and soft grass for picnics. Life was moving forward, not in a straight line, but in cycles of growth and renewal, like the garden itself. And if sometimes, late at night, I still thought about those dark days of discovery and revenge, of Adrian and betrayal, I'd look at Grace, at the life growing inside her, at our carefully tended garden, and know that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was ours to grow.